Part of following Jesus means that we have to learn and practice when it is time to speak and when it is not time to speak, and how to know the difference. When to act and when not to act. Jesus in John 2 seems to tear apart the temple courts, where people are using the location of worship to make money, to talk about money, and to focus on nothing but money. Money may be a means to an end, but when the temptation to focus on that means overtakes us, that is what some of the early Jesus followers called the root of all evil. I have mentioned in these first Jesus Life sermons for 2021 that 2021 is our year of faithfulness in Jesus, faithfulness as person, faithfulness as church. In our two questions, what does this call on me as a person of Jesus? And what does this call on us as a community of Jesus followers? One way to think about such things, about how we together, maybe even just over the past couple of years, how have we arrived at where we are now? Who are we as a community of faith? Who are we? Who has God made us? And then all of these things come together to help us discern God's will for us today and tomorrow. Where is God leading us? Who is God making us? And the answers to those questions are more important than our worldly concerns. This has always been the struggle for the church as the people of Jesus, us, to not let the ways of this world inform the ways of God, but rather the other way around. That the ways of God should be informing our ways in this world. And that takes us right back to the temple courts, where Jesus does something that is still a little bit shocking even to this day. The four passages of Scripture for today, from the readings videos earlier in this playlist, are a little more varied than some of the other weeks leading up to Easter. But there are some common threads. When you covet and steal and don't take your work seriously as service to God, when you measure life by the so-called wisdom of this world, it does not even begin to touch the true wisdom of God. But the reading that stands out in this particular day is the moment when Jesus just trashes the place. And I have to admit that I didn't see that coming. In the other Gospels, this ransacking of the temple courts happens much later in the story, but in the Gospel of John, it's one of the lead stories. It's one of the opening stories, which seems a little odd, unless John was trying to tell us something. Why lead with such a story? So just thumbing back through these four passages. The Exodus 20 passage is the one that includes the Ten Commandments and begins, "Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Even that opening line is going to inform why Jesus does what Jesus does in the temple courts. The Psalm 19 passage includes the teaching that the words of God are to be more desired than gold, which the people of God have a long history of forgetting and sometimes just downright ignoring. Psalm 19. In looking at the whole of creation, There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Speaking of true wisdom. The 1 Corinthians 1 passage is one of my absolute favorites because of the way that it uses this one particular phrase in talking about the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom of God. In one of my favorite sayings in all of Scripture, it says that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And I just love that turn of phrase. A little bit before that, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Paul's way of saying the world has nothing on God. And then Jesus in John 2 tears the temple courts apart. Why lead with such a violent story? Maybe it's because the entire last half of the Gospel of John centers on a moment of extreme violence, namely the crucifixion. Suffering and violence as a part of the truth of John's writings that John's writings are going to tell us. It'd be nice to ignore the suffering of the world. It'd be nice to just not talk about it, but it's real and it's here. And which is especially meaningful, I think, because it's the writings of John that also teach us that God is love. It's all of the above, which is especially important when you consider the follow-up to John, Revelation. But even in a world of violence, we find redemption. But our part is to know when to act, when to speak out, especially against another kind of violence, the kind that takes advantage of people in the name of God, which seems to be what's happening in the temple courts. From John 2, in the temple, Jesus found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And then a few moments later, Jesus does what Jesus does in the temple courts and says, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." When was the last time you were in the temple courts in Jerusalem? Maybe you've been there. I've been there. Been there a few times. A couple of things strike me. Number one, there's a bunch of souvenir shops around what remains of what they think is the remains of the Second Temple. And I thought that was interesting, to say the least, especially in light of John 2. But if you've never been there, let's say you've never been to what remains of the temple in Jerusalem. It's okay. Doesn't matter. Because what we have learned over the years is that your living room, maybe where you're sitting right now, is just as much the presence of God as has ever been the presence of God, and that's what we have in Jesus. And being with God and telling the story is not dependent whatsoever on worldly money. I'm going to tell you about two movies, Network and The Insider, both of which are about the state of news in the 70s and then up into the 90s. Movie Network is about a broadcaster who kind of goes bonkers on air, or at least it appears that way. Although as you go through the story, you realize and you start questioning, did he really go off, or is he having moments of clarity? Whatever the case, the news network decides to use what becomes of his celebrity to make money. Then the insider years later, is actually based on a true story about when 60 Minutes secured the testimony of Jeffrey Wigand, who was a chemist working for Big Tobacco, and he decided to be a whistleblower about the way that Big Tobacco used cigarettes, addiction, nicotine, all that sort of thing. And somewhere in the story, CBS Corporate decides to tell CBS News that they can't run the story. Why? Same reason. Because of money. Because they would get sued. Because they would lose CBS possibly in the whole run of things. Which both stories, from very different angles, talk about how money in 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, how money started driving the news. To figure out what all of this means to you personally and what it means for us as a church is an ongoing conversation. Like the stories about the news, both the fantasy and the reality, money should never drive the way that we tell the truth. And that is certainly true when it comes to the story of God. That was true for Jesus in the temple courts in John 2, that started driving the rest of the story, and it's true to this day. To figure out what this means to us is an ongoing conversation. These conversations about money and faithfulness and how to balance it all are never finished. They're never finished. We will never finish having these conversations. They are the laundry of our theological existence. Just when you think things are all settled and folded and put away, we realize there's still more to do. So, what does this mean for you? Ask yourself this question. What does this mean? And what do these passages of Scripture today mean for me as I live a Jesus life? It's a good question. And only you can answer it for yourself. What if the virtues that we think of as the fruit of God's Spirit, as the outpouring of God's presence among us, what if we can think of those things as actions rather than titles, names? Not love, joy, peace as identity markers, but love, joy, peace as invitations to action. So for this third one on this third day, what about peace? It means one thing to say, I'm a person of peace, but what would that really look like? How would you measure, not that measure is everything, but how would you measure that? If someone said about you, oh, she's a person of peace. Oh, he's really a person of peace. How would people know? It'd be by your actions. The things you say, the things you do, the way that we treat others. We are not peace as a noun, but we are, and I know this is not a real word, but I'm a theologian so I can make up words. We are peace-ing. We are actively peace-ing. And maybe as a play on words, we spend our lives piecing together our day-to-day existence as peace. We spend our days looking to ways that we can be piecing in this world. And that is one that takes a daily commitment. You have to wake up every day. If we're really going to talk about following Jesus, it means waking up on Monday and then waking up on Tuesday with the same exact commitment. I'm going to go about my day doing peace. I'm going to go about my day peacing.